When you look into the history of Jewish people in the American South, you find a story that's just full of contradictions. I mean, it's this incredible mix of pioneering spirit, deep integration, and then this very uncomfortable complicity in slavery. So, how on earth do we make sense of a past that complex? Well, that's exactly what we're going to dig into.
So, were they pioneers, building new communities and looking for a safe haven? Were they loyal Confederates who climbed to the absolute highest ranks of power? Or were they key players in the horrific economy of the slave trade? The answer, as it turns out, really depends on which history book you open.
So, here's what we're going to do. We're going to explore how this history gets told by looking at two very different types of sources: peer-reviewed academic journals on one side and a historical research report on the other. You'll see how the exact same slice of history can be used to tell radically different stories. And that forces us to ask some really important questions about how history gets written in the first place. Okay, let's start by just laying our sources out on the table. You see, the conflict over this history, it begins with the very documents we use to try and understand it. So in one corner, you've got the academic journals. Think of these as scholarly deep dives, peer-reviewed, trying to analyze people and events with a ton of historical context. And in the other corner, you have this research report from the Nation of Islam, which presents a very specific and, let's be honest, very controversial argument about that same history. To make this all a little less abstract, let's zoom in on one man who really seems to embody all of these contradictions: Moses Elias Levi, a major figure in early Florida. Levi's life story, at least according to the Florida Historical Quarterly, sounds like a classic American pioneer tale. He was born in Morocco, made a fortune in the Caribbean, and then bought up tens of thousands of acres in Florida. And his big dream? To create a safe haven, a refuge for European Jews. But, and this is a huge but, that is only half the story. And this is where things get really fascinating and really complicated. On the one hand, Levi is this visionary dreaming of a Jewish utopia. On the other hand, he's a planter whose entire operation was built on the back of the Southern slave economy. He actually wrote a plan to abolish slavery, yet his money and his status were completely tied up in that very system. He is the perfect example of the tension at the heart of this entire history. So Levi's story, with that impossible conflict between his principles and his profits, it leads us right into the most difficult part of this history, the direct role that some Jews played in the institution of slavery. The report from the Nation of Islam, well, it doesn't mince words. It makes its central point loud and clear: that Jewish involvement in slavery wasn't just some fringe thing, but that it was fundamental and widespread. Now, to back this up, the report provides these long lists of names. It calls out merchants like Aaron Lopez in Newport, who was a huge figure in the slave trade, and planters like Benjamin Mordecai, who was literally taking out newspaper ads in Charleston to sell people. The source uses example after example like this to build its case for a deep, systemic involvement. And the data they pull together shows these huge differences depending on where you lived. In big southern cities, look at Charleston, Richmond, Savannah, an estimated 3/4 of Jewish families owned enslaved people. But that number drops way down in cities outside the South. This suggests that for many Jewish people, their participation in slavery was tied to how integrated they were into the local Southern economy. And the argument wasn't just economic. It was also religious. The report points to this very famous sermon from a New York rabbi, Morris J. Raffel, who used the Bible to actually defend slavery. So you can see how religious authority was brought in to give the whole system a kind of moral justification. This deep integration into Southern life really hit its peak during the Civil War, when a lot of Southern Jews became passionate supporters of the Confederacy. Now, academic sources, like the Southern Jewish History Journal, they focus a lot on this theme of integration. They explore how Jewish communities weren't just living in the South, they were often woven right into the social, political, and economic fabric of the place. And you can't talk about this without talking about Judah P. Benjamin. The guy was a brilliant lawyer and politician from Louisiana, and he became one of the most powerful people in the entire Confederacy, a close, trusted advisor to Jefferson Davis himself. I mean, just look at this career path. He held 3 of the most powerful jobs in the Confederate government. They called him the brains of the Confederacy. This just shows you an incredible level of political acceptance and influence for a Jewish person in America at that time. So why so much loyalty to the cause? Well, the academic perspective is that the South's rigid racial hierarchy, with white people on top and black people at the bottom, it weirdly created an opportunity for Jewish people. It allowed them to achieve a kind of social and political equality as white that they just couldn't find anywhere else. And that acceptance created a powerful sense of loyalty. And here we go. This is the collision of the two narratives in its clearest form. While one source is talking about opportunity and equality, the other one makes this really blunt, sweeping claim that every single Jewish religious leader in the South backed the Confederacy. They're both describing the same thing, deep integration, but they are framing it in profoundly different moral terms.
Which brings us to our last and maybe most important question. How can these two histories even exist at the same time? Why are they telling such different stories about the same past? Well, the answer isn't just about the facts they choose to highlight. It's about the fundamental reason why they're telling the story in the first place. Okay, so here's the key. We're looking at two totally different ways of doing history. You've got academic history, which tries to understand the past with all its messiness and nuance, and then you have a polemical narrative, like The Secret Relationship, which uses history to build a case and prove a specific point, usually about an issue we're still dealing with today. To put it really simply, one is trying to explain what happened back then, in its own time. The other is trying to explain why all of that matters right now, by drawing a straight line from the past to the present. And that right there is the main takeaway. It's not about deciding which story is right and which one is wrong. It's about understanding why they're so different. Knowing where a story comes from and what its goal is just as critical as knowing the story itself. Ultimately, this whole debate over the history of Jews in the American South, it isn't just about the past. It really forces all of us to think about how the stories we choose to tell shape who we are, how we relate to each other, and what we think justice looks like today.